So, when I use the term walking simulator, what is the first thing you think of? Is your immediate reaction one of intrigue or boredom? Do you envision an exciting opportunity for exploration, or does it fall flat as a gimmick with little to offer? Regardless, it is a genre of games that has gotten a lot of traction in the past decade or so, with some releases garnering plenty of acclaim and others not so much. Now, you might be thinking, why did I ask the first question at the start of the video, and more precisely, why would some people find it boring? The answer to that lies in the inherent nature of the gameplay, or as its critics would argue, the lack of it. From a pure interactive video game perspective, there is not a lot of input being asked of the player to yield any dramatic changes to what is going on screen. The controls are usually very limited, resulting in the player only being able to walk and press a button or two to interact with the environment. I could see how one would not find much interest in that on the surface, but that's the thing about these types of games. They almost challenge you to look beyond the surface, and ultimately, it becomes a sort of you get out of it what you put in kind of experience. If you're the type of player that likes to rush through games or only focus on what's next, you're going to miss a lot of detail and likely the intended point of the whole experience. So, I think the best way to go about showing you guys why I like these types of games so much and what I personally get out of them would be to create a sampler platter of sorts. I'm going to discuss a trio of titles that I have recently played, which represent the heights, in my opinion, that not only these specific types of games can reach, but also gaming as a whole. I hope it goes without saying that this analysis is going to include spoilers for these games, and since I highly recommend most of them if you get the chance, be sure to play them before watching each analysis. To help with that, I've added timestamps for each game, so you can jump around the video to see games you are more familiar with, and with that being said, let's get into our first game. Firewatch is a 2016 game developed by Campo Santo and is a game that fits right into the category of being one of the most impactful ones I've ever played. Right away, before you have the chance to do anything in the game, heck, before even anything shows up on screen aside from text, the emotional impact was immediately felt. You play as a man named Henry. Henry's life for the first part of this game is told in flickers of text, recounting important experiences of his life. It starts out relatively happy, detailing how he meets a woman at a bar named Julia and how they fall in love. As these screens of text progress, you get the option to react or behave one way or another to certain events in Henry's life, all just through text. And while these choices have little impact on how the game at large progresses, it helps form the image and character you have of Henry in your head. But we'll get back to that detail later. Eventually, though, it takes a sadder turn. Henry finds out Julia has early onset dementia. The gravity of this takes a toll on him, but he's willing to try. Over time, however, his spirit wears down at the same pace that his wife's mental condition does. Julia is forced to step away from her job, and Henry is faced with the burden of additional caretaking for the woman he loves. However, the situation becomes way too much. After some time, Julia's own family steps in and has her move to Australia, where they live, in order to look after her. This was the last straw for Henry. Feeling so detached and helpless with his current condition, he accepts a job as a fire lookout in a national park, just to get away from everything. And this is where the main story of the game begins. At his new job, Henry is equipped with nothing but a radio, a map, and a compass to find his way around the park. He spends his nights in a lookout tower, providing a vantage point over the park to spot any signs of wildfires, and this is what the main gameplay is focused on. Using his radio, Henry communicates back and forth with his supervisor, Delilah. Delilah is sarcastic, but not too mean. Likes to keep things lighthearted, but is also guarded with personal details until later on in the game.
I say you got fired from your job and have finally decided to write your novel. That's the sort of bullshit reason you'll find a man out in the woods.
Their relationship starts off very professionally, with little discussing of personal lives and Delilah directing Henry to do simple tasks. Some of these include finding park vandals, snuffing out campfires, the usual mundane activities that someone at this job would do. Through these radio-based interactions, however, the player is given a choice, not only how to portray Henry, but how to interact with and develop a relationship with Delilah. You can be friendly, neutral, or even ignore her altogether. But as I mentioned is the case with the games of this genre, the most fulfilling experience involves the most interactivity, which is why I don't recommend the silent approach. If Henry starts feeling comfortable enough to start revealing details about his own life to Delilah, Delilah will too.
So, I lied to you. I came out here with a broken heart just like you. I figured you've told me so much about you, so, there's something about me. We both fucked up.
Each chapter, if you want to call it that, takes place on a different day throughout the summer, with a screen detailing how many days have passed since Henry took the position. As these days progress, Henry and Delilah's relationship progresses too, provided the player is interacting with the radio.
I don't talk to the other lookouts as much as I talk to you. Not in the same way. And I know you're not really available, but I want you to know, well, maybe it'd be nice to get together at the end of the summer.
Now, I won't go into every small detail, but the story eventually takes a sudden turn. On his patrol route one day, Henry eventually ends up finding evidence that he's being watched, and someone is even listening in to everything he and Delilah are saying over their radios.
There's a folder of reports here.
What do they say?
They're assessments about the two of us. There's stuff in here about Julia.
Like what?
Stuff I didn't tell you. This is...
What does it say about me? You said there was one about me.
And it looks like they've been following me around. What I do when I'm out hiking? Jesus.
This right away creates a lot of tension, both from a gameplay and story perspective. Given that Henry walks at such a slow pace, the map is large and takes a while to navigate, and navigation is not as easy as a waypoint on a mini-map, since as I said, you have to use a map and a compass to get around. And while no harm directly comes to Henry, there are a lot of moments where it still feels like it might. And Delilah acts as your only lifeline, your only tie to the outside world if something were to happen to you. It is through this experience where you as the player almost begin to depend on Delilah, rely on her, as she is the only way out of some of the scenarios that Henry gets into. But there's not just a dependence from a practical standpoint, but an emotional one too. You've already felt the weight of what Henry has gone through, despite not living it yourself, and talking to and getting to know Delilah has become a cathartic experience for both the player and the character. It gets to a point where the moments of radio silence are too much to bear, leaving you anxiously waiting for the next dialogue interaction. Back to the narrative though, and to make a long story short, Henry and Delilah discover who was stalking them this whole time, leaving a bit of a twist concerning what type of story this was going to be. Again, I want to leave this detail out to encourage those who haven't to go play this game, but essentially, everything is not what it seems. Everything you learn about the person following you and listening to your conversations makes you feel another level of sadness and another level of loss, albeit indirectly. This revelation impacts Delilah way more though, since it involves someone from her past, and this loss becomes another bonding moment for both her and Henry, as they both have had great losses. Coincidentally, and almost fittingly, following all these revelations, a great fire starts, and everyone in the park is forced to evacuate, including Delilah and Henry. A helicopter comes to Delilah's lookout tower, and she tells Henry that she's going to get on it, and that another one will come back for him. This is where the player is given the dialogue option, to let her go, or to plead with her to wait for him to get to her tower.
Wait, just wait, okay? I'm not that far.
No matter what the player chooses, Delilah gets on the helicopter anyway, leaving the player to have never seen Delilah in person.
Delilah! Damn it.
This is one of the most back-breaking instances of false choice in a game, but I believe it had a purpose, and served it well. It wanted you and Henry to not jump ship and idealize Delilah as the cure to all hardship.
I think you should go to Julia, and then you can figure it out. Maybe put that typewriter to good use. Give me a sexy accent or something if you write about this.
Yeah.
You gotta go see her.
Henry came to the park in the first place to get away from all his troubles, not confront them head on.
People take this job to get away from something, so what's wrong?
By doing this, Delilah is extending Henry that opportunity to recover completely and finish that chapter of his life. And only then, once everything has been resolved, could he maybe pursue a relationship with Delilah in the future, as it would only be fair to both him and her.
Maybe you could come back to Boulder with me and figure it out down there.
She already knew about his wife and his circumstances because you are given the opportunity earlier in the game to tell her about your past, and she did not want to be the replacement or the next best thing. She just wanted what was best for Henry, and that is one of the greater forms of love, a sacrifice if ever there was one.
You were sleeping, I guess, and all I heard was the name Jules through the mumbles. I just thought it was so sweet. I wanted to wake you up, but then I thought maybe you were having a nice conversation and I'd just be spoiling it. I hope you're doing okay, when it comes to her.
This is not the last interaction you have with Delilah. As mentioned earlier, a large part of the game revolves around the image or perception of Henry you as the player may have at the beginning of the game, and how he may or may not have changed. In one of your earlier conversations with Delilah, she says she wants to draw you, or Henry.
Hey, Henry?
Yeah.
What do you look like?
Using dialogue choices, you give her a decently detailed description of yourself, and it almost seems like a throwaway moment.
This isn't that hard.
Do you know Raleigh Fingers? He pitched for the A's.
What do you normally like to wear?
Clothes. I don't really think about it.
Oh, come on.
I got a sweatshirt I like, good jacket I got at the Buckle Barn.
Now tell me about your face. I'm looking at you across the bar. What do I see?
Pretty thick beard.
I want to know about your eyes.
Get out of here.
I'm drawing you. I need to know.
Yet, it all comes back when you finally reach Delilah's tower, and after finding out that she had gotten on that helicopter without you, you see one thing on her desk that sticks out among the rest. With one of the final images you see in the game being Delilah's drawing of Henry based on your descriptions, it helps complete the image or character of Henry that we imagined at the beginning of the game, all coming full circle. It's reflective and also funny how a seemingly throwaway conversation at the beginning of the game could cause this much of an emotional gut punch by the end of it. What's interesting is that her drawing is based on the characteristics you gave her, and at the beginning of the game, both Henry and the player are likely in very different headspaces compared to the end of it, so there's a huge potential for internal character evolution right there, all based on a small, simple doodle. And that kind of emphasizes the level of player agency that one gets from this game in the context of walking simulators. Despite having a predetermined backstory with Julia, despite having a relatively linear plot with a fixed ending, that drawing is the one thing we can affect about Henry. It's not just about the player finding out who Henry truly is and what he wants to be, but for Henry too. And since the player is so synonymous with Henry, after having played with him from a first-person perspective and having controlled his dialogue choices, you almost feel a sense of self-discovery too. This game makes you reflect on how you really would have acted and reacted in these situations. It really puts you in the boots of a park ranger with a sad past. Firewatch was a very introspective and memorable experience for its short length, and to me, the emotional journey that it takes you on exhibits the heights that games of this genre can reach. Now, I apologize in advance for the back-to-back gut punches, but what remains of Edith Finch is another game that emotionally captivated me and drained me. It released in 2017 and was developed by Giant Sparrow. My passion for it doesn't seem to be unwarranted, nor is it an isolated experience. It has garnered a reputation as a sort of critical darling, even more so than Firewatch. Speaking of, both this and Firewatch are the two games in this video that I would categorize as not just among the best in the genre, but top tier games as a whole. And because of this, these are probably the two games from this video that I recommend the most. This is not to sell our final game short, however, but we'll get there when we do. With that being said, let's get into this one. As I've already established, these games as a whole are very narrative forward. However, unlike Firewatch, this title spices up its gameplay with moments of variation, leaving no two chapters feeling identical. Obviously, since it is a walking simulator, most of the game is spent, well, walking. But the chapters differentiate themselves by almost switching genres entirely. There are moments where it turns into a visual novel, an underwater swimming simulator, you play as a cat at one point, you get what I'm trying to say. Now, this may all seem very random and disjointed without context, so allow me to break down the story a little bit. The story begins as an unknown player rides a boat, holding a journal that belongs to the titular character Edith Finch. Edith is our narrator throughout the game, and the person we play as for most of it. The basic premise involves 17-year-old Edith returning to her family home after a long time away. We learn from her narration that all of her family is dead, and she's the last one left.
But instead of a family, there were just memories of one.
Her explanation for this, and the driving narrative motif surrounding the game as a whole, is a family curse. This is supported by her detailed stories which explain to the player how each and every one of her family members not only died, but died in either horrific, tragic, or utterly strange ways. And each chapter of the game involves Edith exploring the house, finding out what happened to each family member through a recounting of their death, and adding each member one by one to her journal in a family tree illustration. It is in these recountings where the gameplay switches up and begins to include some fantastical elements. As was the case with Firewatch, I don't want to go into too much detail and explain each and every family member's death, because I believe that they are each so impactful in their original form and deserve to be experienced firsthand. I will say, however, that there is a sort of chronological order in which you learn about each family member, starting with the earliest noted ancestor, Odin Finch, Edith's great-great-grandfather, all the way to her brothers, Milton and Lewis. As this progression occurs, the losses become more personal, because they go from old ancestors that Edith never really met or interacted with to her own brothers, who she grew up with, and this is felt by the player every step of the way. As I mentioned that each death scene involves a switch up in gameplay, there is also a switch up in tone, depending on the manner of death. Some are almost comical in the absurdity of them, some are super stylized and mystical, and others are downright heartbreaking. Arguably, the two most gut-wrenching instances were the deaths of Edith's brother Lewis and her great-uncle, Watr. These are the two that I will mostly focus on. Lewis's section has the most diversity in gameplay, and the bright colors of its setting contrast so heavily with its tragic end. The beginning section has Lewis working at a fish cannery, where he very repetitively grabs a fish off of a conveyor belt, chops off its head, and throws it into the next area. This could not be more perfectly representative of the mundaneness and aimlessness he must feel with his life. This all changes when Lewis begins daydreaming about a fantasy world, which takes the shape of a thought bubble on about half the screen, all while still doing his fish chopping job in the background. In this fantasy world, Lewis is represented by a prince, who is very popular among the townsfolk. The gameplay transitions from a top-down fantasy game to controlling a boat from the same angle, to a third-person over-the-shoulder view, to a first-person view. In this first-person view, we are now Lewis and the prince, all one and the same. It is no longer represented as a daydream, but instead it takes up the whole screen. We enter the castle, where a ceremony takes place, and our crown is waiting for us. We walk up to the throne, bow our heads to have the crown put on us, and it ends. All abruptly, just like that, in the middle of what was supposed to be a happy moment. It is implied that Lewis took his own life, in the same manner of the fish, and we were watching it all happen through the lens of a fantasy world. The way the players yanked out of that scenario so forcefully, so suddenly, only compounds the pain. And this arguably hurts the worst, because this was Edith's brother, someone who was relatively close in age to her, and someone she knew growing up. Because of the similar manner of abruptness, Watr Finch's death was just as big of a blow. Watr Finch was a big believer in the family curse, and after experiencing a scary moment firsthand, he locked himself in a bunker underneath the house and hid for 30 years, hoping that if he never did anything, the curse could never get him. There are parallels here between his and Lewis's section, where there is a repetitive gameplay loop. Instead of shopping fish, Watr opens canned food. With the passage of large gaps of time, you see the calendar change, but largely, everything else stays the same, including a rumbling up above, which is a train that occurs at the same time every day. Only one day, the rumbling doesn't happen, and this sparks something within Watr.
I'm done waiting.
He begins to think, maybe the curse can't get him. He finally steps into the outside world.
But I need to stop living the same day, even if it kills me.
He proclaims that he doesn't care how long he lives, whether it be one more day or a few years, but what he ultimately wants is to take back his own life and stop living in fear. And yet, in a twist of tragic irony, mere moments after stepping outside onto train tracks and seeing the sky for the first time in years, he's struck by a train and killed instantly. Both of the sudden manners in which each death occurs really emphasize the brevity and fragility of life. We don't know how long we're going to be here, and no matter our circumstances, whether it be something as insignificant as petty family disputes or as mythical as a family curse, we should make the most of it. Our time is up when it is up, and there is no waiting. It is a hard fact of life, and a tough pill to swallow. But I believe that presenting it in the manner that it did, What Remains of Edith Finch, makes it a little more digestible, while preserving the strength of its message. And there's no other genre of game in which this subject matter could have been presented as effectively. With you, a passive spectator to the family tragedies and Edith's narration. Only, that's not all. In one last revelation, you find out the player at the beginning, whom you likely already forgot about, is Edith's child. Edith did not survive childbirth. And you, both the player and her child, are learning about the tales of the Finch family, all through her journal.
This is where your story begins. I'm sorry I won't be there to see it. It's a lot to ask, but I don't want you to be sad that I'm gone. I want you to be amazed that any of us ever had a chance to be here at all. Good luck.
The reason I mentioned that you likely forgot about the player at the beginning is because so much of the focus is on Edith, explaining everything, experiencing the tales from her tellings, that you grow so attached to her. You become her. And just to have that all ripped away, to find out that the supposed family curse got her too, well, that's just painful. The execution of this reveal could not have happened in any other genre, where the sheer amount of detail and exposition engrosses you so deeply that you become blind to the perspective from which the story is told. That level of immersion simply can't happen anywhere else. It is a betrayal of who the player assumes they are, done so tactfully, so smoothly, that I can't help but admire it. Gone Home is the final game I will be discussing in this video, and it is also the one that I played most recently. It is a 2018 game published by the Fulbright Company, and is set on a seemingly uneventful weekend in the middle of summer. The player assumes the role of a 21-year-old named Katie, who is returning home after some time away on a trip to Europe, hence the name of the game. Only, once she arrives, she finds no one is there to greet her. It's a little odd, considering that the beginning cutscene involves a voicemail from Katie to her mother saying the specific day that she would be home and around what time.
Hi, Mom. So I got my ticket home from Europe. I get back on June 6th, but it's a really late flight because that was the cheapest, so it gets in at midnight. But don't worry, I'll get a shuttle from the airport so you don't have to pick me up. Like, really seriously, you don't have to. Okay, so, love you. See you soon. Bye.
So this immediately creates an air of mystery surrounding the whole setting, and that is where the game begins. Before I get into the rough plot summary, I would like to preface this one with a few things. Remember at the beginning of the video where I said that this genre and the fulfillment that comes from it is entirely dependent on how much effort the player places in discovery and taking their time? Well, that piece of advice is emphasized tenfold in Gone Home. Gone Home is the game, more so than any of the three on this list, that does not hold your hand whatsoever. There's no obvious objective, no list of things to get through, not even a waypoint, nothing. So what is there to do? Well, you could start by opening drawers. Kidding. Only slightly. When I say there is a lot to discover here, I'm not kidding. While it only took me about 3 hours to finish, and that was with taking my time, I thought I had been thorough, but wow, was I wrong. Not only is your enjoyment dependent on how much you choose to discover and look into details, but also being able to figure out the narrative itself. The less items you find and letters you read, the fewer pieces you have of the whole puzzle. The main narrative is about your younger sister, Sam. Sam is characterized as the rebellious younger sibling, who doesn't have the best relationship with her parents. This is evidenced not only through journal entries detailing her frustration with them, but also plenty of graded assignments or disciplinary reports from school that can be found around the house. That's just one example of how so much can be pieced together about the characters in the game just by finding little scraps of information. And that's the other thing that's cool. You form entire storylines and relationship threads all while being the only person in this house and never seeing any of them. But back to Sam. You eventually find out that Sam has run away. And given that you found out about her rebellious nature, this isn't the most surprising revelation, but there's a little more to it than that. As you progress through the house, you find even older documents, which lead to audio journal entries that the player can listen to.
Oh my god. You are so lucky you finished high school before we moved into this house. So, it's the first day of school, and there I am, introducing myself to the class.
There's this sort of chronological progression of Sam's character that you receive piece by piece, hoping to find out the exact reason why she ran away. You learn she struggled to make friends at school, was a bit of a loner, and appeared to have more interest in girls than boys, which was a point of contention, not just with Sam's school, but with her relationship with her parents as well. Sam's parents aren't the most approving of this, and view it as it's just a phase, the old adage. But as Sam details in one of her entries,
Well, joke's on them, because they're in for one very long phase.
and that's where Lonnie comes in. Lonnie is revealed to be Sam's love interest. Through the journal entries, Sam forms a bit of a crush on her, slowly gets to know her, before they both fall deeply in love with each other. Both Katie and the player learn about the dates they have, the times they've spent at each other's houses, and how Sam really sees a future with Lonnie. Until Lonnie reveals that she has enlisted for the army, and doesn't know when she's going to see Sam again. This breaks Sam, naturally, as she doesn't really have a personal relationship with anyone else. No friends, not her parents, and strangely, not even really Katie for that matter, or, as much as one would think, for sisters that are close in age. There's a letter written by Sam that Katie can find that carries a hint of jealousy, with her detailing that her mom and dad won't let her go to the city, but Katie can go to Europe and is only a few years older. And that establishes the clear disconnect that exists, not just between Katie and Sam, but between Katie and her family as a whole. You see, we have just established a reason for why Sam isn't here, but where are the parents? Katie called well in advance, letting them know the exact day she'd be home. Yet, as the player can discover by looking at the calendar, her parents have taken a week-long vacation, which happens to coincide with when Katie comes back. The game doesn't explicitly reveal that Katie's parents don't let her know of these plans, but if she were aware, why would it be implied as a surprise when she finds that nobody is in the house? Further evidence of this lack of communication comes from being able to listen to the answering machine, where the player can find that Katie's message revealing her arrival date has not yet been listened to.
Hi, Mom. So I got my ticket home from Europe. I get back on June 6th, but it's a really late flight.
Meaning, that her parents never knew when she was coming back in the first place. But now we're getting too deep into it, so let's get back to Sam. One of the final things that the player can find out about Sam is a message from Sam, revealing that Lonnie called her the day that she was supposed to leave for deployment, and told her she couldn't go through with it.
Katie, I fell asleep in the attic, in Lonnie and my old spot, and I missed the first 2 calls. I just barely caught the third one before the machine got it. And it was Lonnie, on a payphone. She'd been on the bus to basic, and she said she couldn't think of anything but me and us, and that she couldn't go through with it, with the army and being a part and all of it. And so she got off the bus in Salem. She said, "Sam, I want you to pack up everything you can and get in your car and come find me. And let's just drive until we find somewhere for us." And she asked me if I could do that. And I said yes. Yes.
So naturally, that's where Sam has gone. She left home to be with Lonnie, the one person she cared about most and who cares most about her. It's also left ambiguous as to whether she'll be back or not. She implies that she's going to start a new life, and that one day
I'll see you again. Someday. Love, Sam.
So not all is lost with Sam and Katie's relationship. She felt that there was enough there to trust her and tell her about her whereabouts, but their relationship wasn't enough to keep her at home. She had been far away for far too long. And so that's where the primary story ends. Like I said, it's pretty short, but that's not exactly the whole picture. Only a fragment of it. Remember how I said that it's like a puzzle earlier? Through further discovery, which I won't detail too much here, you can find out more about the personal lives of Katie's mom and dad, as well as their own struggles. You can learn that Katie's dad is a struggling author, and that Katie's mom is highly considering an affair because of how strained their marriage has become. None of this is exactly essential to the main storyline, but it really helps paint a cohesive image of the kind of environment that was existing, all while Katie was gone, all without her knowledge. And this creates an interesting parallel. If you refuse to explore too deeply, and only pursue the Sam storyline, you'll have a very narrow view of the whole picture. You won't know all the intricacies and nuances propelling the narrative forward. You won't know all the whys in the hows. You'll be just like Katie, prior to coming home, having a perception of how things might be, but never knowing the full story. I liked this game a good amount. Do I think it's as masterful or as compelling as the prior two? No, but it didn't have to be. It told the story that it wanted to, using a somewhat unconventional presentation. And because of this, it made a relatively simple story of a struggling family with a runaway child into something much more gratifying, because you had to earn it, scrape every last inch of the house for it, and that's why I love these types of games so much. I hope after watching this, you guys can see where I'm coming from, and hopefully I've inspired you to maybe check out one or all of these games, or if you've managed to play all three like I have, maybe it'll motivate you to pursue more like them. Sure, they're not difficult in the conventional sense. They don't necessarily provide any form of accomplishment for overcoming something, but they exist in their own little niche in the gaming world. They're comforting, and above all, they're experiences. I'm a big proponent of gaming as an art form, and if it takes experimentation in this form to continue to push the boundaries as to what is considered art by the general masses, then so be it. Gaming doesn't have to confine itself to be one thing, and not all games have to be like these. I'm just glad they exist, and hopefully, you can be too. Thank you.